So, red lightning. It's very hard for us to begin to comprehend how people around the world reacted to the Russian Revolution. You're talking about 1917. Most workers were just beasts of burden. Very few places, even in the advanced capitalist countries in Europe, you were beasts of burden. You had no protections, you had improper diets, just nothing. Life was a brutal thing. And when the Russian Revolution happened, when workers took power and promised to transform the world, it was like an explosion. I mean, it was like this amazing thing. We've never experienced anything like that. I'm an old man, I've never experienced anything like that. And I have seen victories. I've seen the civil rights victory, I've seen the anti-Vietnam War victory. So, those were big things, but this was something fundamentally different. The dead of the Paris Commune have risen under the banner of the Soviets. The Russian revolutionaries drew on history. They, especially the Paris Commune, which I'm not going to get into here, but there was a lot of Agitprop art, the beginnings of Agitprop art that came out of the French Revolution. You may have seen paintings by Courbet. Well, people carried paintings by Courbet through the streets. They always remove that context. By force of arms, we've smashed the enemy with our hands. We will get bread. Comrades, get down to work. Well, that's what happened. The working class got down to work. There were all kinds of labor brigades, all kinds of activities that went on, including the involvement of masses of workers in art-making activities. The program for public art was set in motion by Vladimir Lenin in 1918, 1 year after the Russian Revolution. And he cited the Renaissance treatise of Tommaso Campanello. I don't know if anybody has heard of him. But anyway, he was an Italian theologian who was tortured by the Inquisition and spent 27 years in prison being tortured. Not a pleasant life. But in the process, he wrote a book called The City of the Sun. And it was this utopian vision for a future world where everything was owned in common, right? So, and one of the things he said was that you have to cover the walls of the cities with frescoes. And in initiating this program, Lenin talked about that, and that's what they began to do. The streets are brushes, the squares are palettes. That's what Mayakovsky, the great poet, said. The streets were decorated for hundreds of festivals and demonstrations. He, as he said, I want to read this little poem because it's really so wonderful. We are the architects of Earths, the planet's decorators. We are the wonder makers. The sunbeams we shall tie in radiant brooms and sweep the clouds from the sky with electricity. We shall make honey sweet the rivers of the world. The streets of earth will pave with radiant stars. Come to us from the hall. Come hither, one and all. Come hither, actor, poet, director. It was this amazing, inspiring call for people to come forward. And they did. And these are some of the street demonstrations. And then workers also did this. So workers in the factories, telephone workers, railroad workers. The ships here are floats for the Red Army, because soldiers were encouraged to make art. All the factory workers were encouraged to make art where they worked. And that began to happen. Everybody was making stuff. It was an amazing moment. There were incredible literacy campaigns, because you're talking about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Empire was composed, and later the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was composed of 15 nations. Big nations, including like Ukraine, Turkmenistan, all these countries, all the stands. But they were all illiterate. And so there were these mass literacy campaigns. There were mass women's rights campaigns. On March 8th, they called Women's Emancipation Day. And that is the origin of International Women's Day. You know, it was originally International Working Women's Day, and it began in the Russian Revolution. And it was led by socialists. And, of course, these things get co-opted. These are big broadsheets called Rosta windows. And they're like cartoony things, and I won't get into what they're all saying. There were different kinds. They were silk screened largely. There were these huge things that were silk screened. And what would happen with them is they would be loaded onto Agitprop trains that I'm going to show you in a minute. And they would be sent all over this vast empire because there was no communication throughout, you know, anywhere. There was some telegraph, but that was it. If you want to see Agitprop trains in action, in the movie Reds about John Reed that Warren Beatty made, really interesting film, but there's these scenes of these colorful trains that are just going across these vast steeps, and the peasants all lined up to watch. And so you have to actually imagine that these are bright colored trains. And somebody should colorize these things. Anyway, so graffiti artists didn't invent painting trains. These are a group of Russian artists who were painting Agitprop trains. And there were hundreds, if not thousands of these. They painted everything. And they particularly tried to use it. This is the Red Cossack. They particularly tried to advance these, exploited countries that had not had, because the Russian aristocracy was very, Eurocentric, looking to Paris and all that kind of stuff. And they consciously were going to promote the indigenous peoples, the peoples in the oppressed nationalities. Some of the trains worked like flip books. So you were standing on the side because the peasants would come and watch. Mm-hmm. And as the train went by, some of them were like flip books, right? Along with trains, there were Agitprop ships. This is the Red Star. They painted the ship, everything. There were Agitprop carts. There were Agitprop buses. If it could move, they painted it. And, we see these pictures that are black and white, but actually there was this explosion of color because everything was being painted. It was very expressive. In much the same way that graffiti was first so expressive when it emerged, spray can art, just this burst of color. And that's what it was like. Now, on the Agitprop trains, they had cinema cars. And so, and in the cinema cars, here you see people going into them. There were art galleries. They had art shows in the trains. So it would come into your little shtetl or whatever, and you could go in. And inside the cinema cars, you could watch movies by the greatest filmmakers of that time, people like Ziga Vertov and Eisenstein, who were making these experimental films unlike anything else in the world. So here are these peasants who can't read or write, who've been treated like beasts, basically, who never left their little plot of land. And suddenly, there's all this stuff that they're exposed to and they're allowed to see. This is Ziga Vertov, famous movie of his called Man with a Camera. And in it, he really kind of invented the use of photo montage in film. Eisenstein, if you think of The Godfather, and they make all this to do about the stair scene in The Godfather, where what's his name uses it effectively, but all he did was take it from Eisenstein. If you watch Potemkin or Strike or 10 Days That Shook the World, amazing films, and they hold up very well to this day. This is Alida, Queen of Mars. It was a film made in 1920, and that's Alida there. She's a three-boober. That's how you know.
Like Total Recall.
Yep. They were. Anyway, it was a film about some revolutionaries going to Mars, right? And they meet, and it gets all involved. I won't tell you the story, but it gets all involved, and there's a revolution on Mars, and there's all this stuff that happens. The sets for this thing was unbelievable, right? I mean, they just had all these Cubo-futurist sets made and everything.
Is this on YouTube by any chance?
Yes, it is available.
Okay.
It was so amazing. And the peasants, the world was so transformed at this time that there are times, at least I read accounts, where peasants would ask, what do the Martians think of this? Because they'd seen these movies. And it was no more astounding to think that there were marshals than to think that you aren't going to be beaten on your job and that you would have a say in what you were producing. It was all this magical time. And so, people thought, what do the Martians think? I mean, I wonder to this day what they think, I have to tell you. The Communist International was formed after the initial coalition taking of power in 1917. The idea of the Communist International was to spread the revolution throughout the world. And there were calls to form communist parties all over the world, and people responded. There was a mass communist party in the United States with hundreds of thousands of people who were either in it or supported it. There were mass socialist parties. It was a very revolutionary time, and it was really inspired by what they saw happening in the newly formed Soviet Union, and the Communist International helped to organize that. This is Vladimir Tatlin's monument to the Third International, the Communist International. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this image before. But sometimes, this is one of the few images from this time that you might see in an art history course. Mostly you don't. But when they do, they just talk about the formal qualities of it. They talk about the design and everything like that. But here's what it was meant to be. It was based on a Tower of Babel painting by Bruegel. And Tatlin himself was a sailor, too. He was a ship's carpenter as well as an artist. And it was supposed to represent the dialectic of the revolution, these helix forms that would spin around. It was made of iron, glass, and steel, and would span the Neva River, or the Neva River. It would have dwarfed the Eiffel Tower and would have been the highest building on Earth.
Wow.
And it was a symbol of modernity, not just the idea of socialism, but just the idea of modernity. And the main form was the twin helix, which spiraled up to 400 meters, and which, if you were a visitor, you would be transported around it. You would go up these circular things on little jitneys they would have. So you'd get on a little thing and you would ride around this thing, and it would take you to the top. The main framework contains 4 buildings. Now you can see kind of a little checker thing in the center. It's a little hard to see. But those are actually buildings suspended in the center of this thing. At the base was a cube, and it was designed as a venue for lectures, conferences, performances, and it rotated on its axis once a month. Above that was a pyramid-shaped building, and it housed the offices and the organizing centers, things like that. And it completed a rotation. Oh, I'm sorry, the base went once a year. The pyramid went once a month. Above that is a cylinder, and it would house information. It would be a propaganda center, and would have radio loudspeakers and things to broadcast to the masses below. And it would rotate once a day. And at the very top was a sphere for radio equipment and a giant open-air screen that you could watch, and projectors that would beam messages onto clouds as they floated by, right? Now, this is being described, right? And this is a bunch of cold people who don't have enough to eat, right? You know, the idea that you could actually build this thing was never going to happen. But workers made models of it, and they carried them on demonstrations. And, one of the things that this period shows is that you don't have to talk down to the workers about art. You don't have to have just, well-rendered, realistic type things. This was a very complex piece, and to them it represented the revolution. And so they made models of it, and they carried it on demonstrations. Everything was up for grabs, all because the revolution said, we're going to build a new world. Everything's going to be different now. Why should we do anything that's the same? As Marx called it, the overturn of all existing social conditions. Why should we have the clothes that they give us? Think about the kind of clothes people wore back then. And so, and especially the women artists who were really promoted for the first time, would design all these amazing clothes that made sense, so that the clothes made sense. This is a group of costumed performers in the intermission of some performance, and they would march out and dance around with their different outfits and stuff. This is great artist Rodchenko, and this was an outfit. They would make their own outfits, and this was an outfit he designed for workers. So you'd go on your job, of course it was physical labor at that time, and you'd have all these giant pockets, and you could easily take it off so you wouldn't get your better clothes dirty, and it was really rugged. In other words, it was all very functional, and it was made for the new world. The idea was that you designed things for the new world, that you don't accept anything as it is. And why should a teapot be round, right? Why shouldn't a plate have hammers and sickles on it? Why shouldn't the textiles show workers in the field? Everything was up for grabs. In fact, why should we live on Earth? And this was a building that it was designed to float. It would float in the air, and people would have their little apartments or units, including children who would have their own, because we're not going to oppress children anymore, yes. Right? So the idea was, and you would go in there on your Zeppelin. See, these are all the little Zeppelins parked out there. Now, for 1 second, I'll just show something of my own right behind you, because these are. This is stuff, I put these in my image. Oh, yeah. I put a lot of this kind of stuff in my work, because nobody knows what it is, and they go, what is that? And I get to explain this thing, right? And it's just so magical, right? I mean, why should we live in it? You have the helium thing, and it lifts the building up, and away you go. Everything was different. It was the experimental theater of Vsevolod Meyerhold, who became one of the greatest theater designers of the epoch. And they would do all this, cubo-futurist kind of stuff with all these outfits and everything. And they would have mass spectacles. So it wasn't just that you went to see experimental theater. You became the actors. They would have these mass spectacles, these pageants, with tens of thousands of people would come out, and they would reenact episodes of the Revolution or things like that. And here you see, this is a mass theater about poverty or something. They would use all these, basically, three-dimensional cartoon figures to express things.
What year would this be?
It was in, this period that I'm talking about is from 1917 to the mid-1920s. Not long.
So like
Not long. This is a mass spectacle called the Fraternization of Workers, Peasants, and the Army. And there were actually these statues like of the Tsar and stuff. And what they would do is they would build these amazing, 3D cubo-futurist forms around them. This is a performance by the children's communes. After the revolution, all the Western imperialist countries invaded Russia, including the U.S., to overturn the revolution. And so many workers were killed that there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of orphan children. And what they did was, the children were encouraged, and they organized themselves into these children's communes. And the children ran them. And they also organized mass spectacles and mass theater. And just learning art activities. And this little photo down here I love because it's little children drawing from the nude model, right? And, the old culture was very puritanical, it was the aristocracy living under the Tsar, But everything was changed. There was no problem. Why shouldn't we learn how to draw like this, This is an amazing piece of work. In 1922, this artist named Avramov he was a composer and a kind of a performance artist, and he staged the Symphony of Factory Sirens. And it took place in Baku, which is a port city. And it's actually part of Azerbaijan, which was one of the countries that was part of the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Socialist Republic. And it was in celebration of the 5th anniversary of the revolution. Now, back then, every little workplace had a whistle, because workers didn't necessarily have timepieces, and so the way you got to work was, first of all, they had people who would walk around and yell, "Get up," Nagropers. But also you had all these whistles. There were hundreds, thousands of these factory whistles. And what they did was they organized a symphony of the factory whistles. And so what they did is they had the conductors, or they built these special wooden towers, and on top were conductors that could see other conductors off in the distance. And they had flags and torches, and they would mutually conduct these thousands of sirens. And they were all the workers came out, and they formed giant choruses and dances. Right? They came out and they sang and danced as part of this thing. The Caspian, all the ships in the Caspian Sea in that area used their foghorns as part of the symphony. So they'd be told when to blow the things, they would blow the foghorns. There were cannons, hydroplanes. There were the guns. They used artillery for the percussion. And it was just this amazing thing, right? So if you can imagine, back then, you're a beast one day, and the next day, you're part of creating this incredible music, and you're out in this giant chorus, and you're being told you should be creative, and you should do these things. And this is very important. When I began to learn these things, that's when I realized I had read a lot of political stuff. I was a socialist for many years before I got onto this stuff. And you read Trotsky, you read Lenin, you read all these people, and it's wonderful stuff. But it doesn't really explain why these workers fought to the death to keep the revolution, because in World War II, when the fascists came, they built barricades of their bodies basically to defend the revolution, because this is what does it. This is why you fight to create a new world. This is a drawing This was planned for the summer of 1920. It's a project for a theatricized military parade for the Congress of the Third International, entitled The End of Capital. And it was mostly women artists who organized this. It was a performance composed of 200 riders from the cavalry school, 2,300 foot soldiers, 16 big guns, 5 airplane searchlights, several armored trains, tanks, and motorcycles. And what they did is they would march from the closed city of capitalism on the left to the open city of socialism on the right. And they would perform a mass dance as they did it. I have no idea what it looked like. I would have loved to have seen it. And Zeppelins up ahead, would have banners in all the different languages of the world, calling for solidarity and revolution. This was never performed. But the ideas of it, the ideas were so important. This is Alewitz, who's a famous Russian artist, and these paintings that they began to do. This is called Pround 19D. The paintings that began to emerge, the suprematists and the other art schools, the idea was open space. You open space up. You open the world up, you see? You see through. Because painting up until then was mostly closed, you see? Everything's closed in. It's a scene. It's like you're looking through a little window and there's, people in a boat or whatever, right? This is open. And it doesn't have to have forms that are recognizable. Now, when the minimalists came along in the 1950s and 60s, they began, and when you read about them, they began to create things that looked like this. But they were totally there was no context to it. What the minimalists said was, we don't want any politics in our paintings. We just want flat surfaces paintings. This was all about politics. This was all about the world, how you see the world. This is a piece by Alewitz. It's called Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge. The white armies were the imperialist armies that invaded Russia to overturn the revolution. The Red Wedge was the revolution. So even though this is this non-objective piece, right? It's not abstract, it's not objective. It's just forms. And as formal painting, as formal design, it's very powerful. But then there's this whole other element that was understood by people. Yeah, we're the Red Wedge. And those are the white armies. And all of these schools of art that came out of this, it was all about creating a new way of seeing. The idea was, we're going to have a new world. The workers are going to run it. Everything's going to be different. And the way we see has to be different. We can't see the way we used to see. We have to envision a new world. These were the ideas that were being put forward. Not just to an elite of the artists, but to the whole population. That's what people were told. That's what was in the newspaper. Even the way art shows were put on. Why do we have to put the stuff just in a row where you walk along and you look at them? They would have shows where the paintings would be on the ceiling and, whatever. And then, of course, there was a lot of stuff outside. The idea was, we're just not going to do this the same way anymore. We have a new world. We don't live in the old world. We live in the new world. And you can see that with these sculptures, same kind of idea. The idea of open space. You have to open the space. You have to open the world. Well, I don't want to go on too long, so I do want to say a few things. I'm going to leave the Soviet Union, and I'm just going to say a few things about how that tradition, in some ways, transmogrified itself in the United States, because there was some pretty cool Agitprop art in the United States too. Some of you may be familiar with the Wobblies. the industrial workers of the world, the IWW. And that was the first attempt to organize really a mass militant revolutionary union. And they had hundreds of thousands of members and followers. And it was poor workers. Poor workers. They rode the rails. Hundreds of them would be on the trains traveling, looking for work. They had a very rich tradition of singing and cartooning and writing poetry. This is Joe Hill, who you may have heard of. His songs have been sung by, a lot of folky type people. And they would always begin their meetings with songs and poetry. If you went to, now, for those of you who may be union members, if you ever, I've been in all different kinds of unions. You go to a union meeting, the last thing that's going to happen is anybody going to sing and write poetry. They're going to make you do the Pledge of Allegiance, or something really hard. But the IWW conducted these amazing free speech fights, and this is where we had won the right to speak in the United States. Prior to the Wobblies, if you got up if you tried to hold a meeting outdoors or something, you'd just be arrested. You weren't allowed to do it. You couldn't do these things. And what the Wobblies did, they held what were called free speech fights. Very famous one in Spokane, Washington, for example. I painted some stuff about it. They would all say, all right, we're all going to Spokane, because some people got arrested for speaking. And they would all show up, and they would soapbox. They would get up on a soapbox or something, and they would start speaking. And they'd get arrested, and they'd go to jail. And more Wobblies would come, and they'd get arrested. And they'd fill up the jail. And then they'd open a stadium, because so many people were coming and doing this. And they didn't fill up the stadium. And they just kept coming. And until they won the right to speak. That's how we got these things. It was for fights like that. Interestingly enough, they would study like the poems of Walt Whitman, and different activists would learn different stuff, so that when you were in jail, you could recite to each other, right? Or you could sing to each other. You would all learn different things so that you could share this stuff. It was amazing cultural stuff. It's been lost. It's been rubbed out. One of the things that the Wobblies did was, and this was actually before the big pageants that took place in the Soviet Union, was the Paterson Silk Strike Pageant. There was a silk strike in Paterson, New Jersey, silk workers, 21 different languages. They had to translate all the meetings and everything into 21 different languages. And yet they built unity of male and female workers, the young and the old, all these different nationalities. It was amazing. This was 1915, I think, this amazing event. And in the midst of it, John Reed, who was, a kind of a Greenwich Village radical, he wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. He was the radical journalist. He was the original romantic radical journalist, John Reed. Organized some of the artists in New York to do the backdrops and stuff. The workers marched from Paterson, New Jersey, to New York. They marched down to Madison Square Garden. Overhead were the letters IWW were in electric lights. They marched onto the stage, and they reenacted the strike. And it was a packed thing in Madison Square Garden, and the audience became the performers, and the performers became the audience. And it was just a very magical moment. Pageantry had been, a big art form in the U.S. up until that time. People would go and reenact Columbus, sailing and landing and whatever, this kind of civic pride bullshit. After this, they pretty much put an end to any pageants. Just like destroyed that art form. This is a great little thing that very few people know about. This was called the Trenton Siege by the Army of Occupation. And this was a sit-down strike in 1936. And what the workers did, it was really performance artists. They took over the State House in Trenton, New Jersey, and they all adopted these personas of, they were all walking around puffing cigars and, just being windbags and stuff. And they were just acting like politicians, And they would just plan things. Somebody would get up and say, we need full employment. And somebody would get up, and then one of them would go, full employment, you can't do that, And they would just have these back and forth things. They were very funny, whatever. And the workers had to stay in the State House in order to, protect the performance that was going on. So this is a shot of them sleeping there. During the great sit-down strikes of the 1930s, you may have heard of the Flint sit-down strike, which was how the auto industry was organized. The workers took over the factories. There was huge strike waves during the 1930s. And the workers formed an orchestra. And inside the plant, people who had different instruments. They held classes and studied different things. In other words, there was this very rich culture. And your life revolved around what you were doing with your coworkers through your union. Unions had radio stations. Unions had dances. Unions had bands. Unions had chess clubs. They had reading clubs. When you got off work, you went down to the union hall. And that's what your life was about. That's all been lost. I mean, the ruling class went to war against all these ideas, and they beat it out of us generation after generation. This is a shot about a Buffalo sit-down strike. I painted the history of that for them. And they occupied the plant, and the workers had a band that they played from the rooftop to serenade the mass. There were mass pickets below to protect the strikers so that the military couldn't go in after them. And so they would be up there playing, and people would be marching and listening, or then they would also have dances, so they'd be down there dancing while this was going on. They won the strike, and after the strike, the orchestra transformed itself into a marching band, and they marched around Buffalo to celebrate the thing. Pretty cool, huh? Some of this stuff has cropped up from time to time. I'm going to wrap up here. May, June of 1968, when 10 million workers went out in France, and there were all these incredible posters and performances and just very inventive things that went on. During the Vietnam anti-war movement, we did all kinds of stuff. When we tried to start a labor party, we had the Cultural Workers and Artists Caucus, and we made puppets and had concerts and did all kinds of things like that. These are little things, little sporadic things. This was a mural I painted with striking meat packers in Austin, Minnesota. And the wall had been blank for decades. But when they went on strike, when they began to organize, it was a very militant strike. They went up against the National Guard and they spread their strike throughout the country. They sent people around the country. It became clear, we need a mural on the wall. That's when it becomes clear. When workers go into motion, they immediately try to make art. They immediately begin to express themselves. I've been watching with a lot of excitement, the development of a whole new art form that's emerged over the past couple decades, sign making at demonstrations. Used to be 20 years before, during the 70s and 80s, whatever, you went to a demonstration, you showed up, somebody handed you a pre-printed placard, and you marched around with it. And it had a slogan on it. Now, people all try to make the best sign they can. They're funny, they're poignant, they're, just really clever. It's a new art form. It's a new emerging art form.
They're memes.
Huh?
They're memes.
Well, yeah, that too. That too. So anyway, well, I showed you already. I was just going to point out some of these images. So I put a lot of these images in here. The black cat is a symbol of sabotage. Bread and roses was a symbol of the labor movement. Because women textile strikers carried a banner that said, "We want bread and roses too. We want economic justice. We're fighting for economic justice, but we want beauty in our lives. We're not just about toiling. We're not just about making money for capitalists." And so bread and roses, I paint bread and roses in a lot of my murals. A lot of these things, so people ask it. And that's what we need to do. We need to relearn our traditions. We don't have to reinvent them. We have to relearn them. There's a difference. The North American working class has a very militant history, but it's been suppressed. I'm going to show you up here. This is a mural I painted in Mexico City. And when I got to Mexico, the workers asked me to paint these two figures. Anybody know who they are that I haven't told in the past? It's Albert Parsons and Lucy Parsons. Does anybody know Albert and Lucy Parsons? Well, Albert Parsons was, and Lucy were organizing in the labor movement for the 8-hour day in Chicago. There was a famous incident, the Haymarket events, where a bomb went off and 11 anarchists and trade union leaders were charged, framed up, and executed. Albert Parsons was one of those people who was executed. May Day, you may have heard of May Day. May Day is the international holiday of the working class. If you're in Senegal or Mozambique or Brazil or Japan, you don't work on May 1st. People around the world don't work on May 1st. It's International Workers' Day, except in this country. May Day is a commemoration of the fight for the 8-hour day in Chicago and the execution at the Haymarket. The whole world celebrates the militancy of North American labor. And we don't know. I painted a second part of that in Chicago, and I put them in Chicago. This was a huge mural. A very militant Teamster local that had just won a strike victory against UPS.
I'm from Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you know all about that.
Well, no, I just mean it's very militant.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Chicago was a center of the labor movement.
Yeah.
But this UPS local, we had a big rally. There were hundreds of people out there, and nobody knew who they were either. So, nobody knows. How would you know? How would you know? Today, we know about some of these people. We know about Sojourner Truth. We know about Marcus Garvey a little bit, because we fought for Black Studies programs, and we won Black Studies programs. We know a little about Harriet Tubman, or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, or Margaret Sanger, because we fought for women's studies programs, and we fought to relearn these things. But we haven't done that with labor yet. So we have this incredible rich history, and yet it's been lost to us. So we have to relearn. That's part of what we have to do. I mean, we need to overthrow capitalism, and that's going to be a big job. So we need the big toolkit with a lot of stuff in it. But all of this, in my experience, showed to me both my personal experience organizing stuff with workers and learning about it, is that if you unleash the creative power of the working class, they're ready to go. They will respond. If they have a chance, they will do it. And when you unleash that power, then you can win anything. You can win anything, because we control things. Nothing turns without the workers. Ultimately, all we have to do is take control. It's a matter of consciousness. So, let's go do that.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, what do you guys think?
Fantastic.
Isn't that cool stuff?
Exceptional.
The Agitprop train especially, just because the setting, how you're describing it, where it's coming through as this blast of color, especially the ones where you can go on board. But just like bringing that to somewhere it hadn't been seen, that is really powerful. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what. Well, that's why people would think they were Martians. You know, because it was no more. Well,
Yeah, it's not no more of a leap of faith.
people didn't know how to read or write. They went in. They lived in huts. They grew some potatoes and carrots and cabbage if they were lucky. They had enough to eat. But there was also mass starvation. There were famines. They were not educated. They had no access to culture. They had no medical care. They died when they were 35 or 40 years old. They were treated like beasts. They didn't have clothing. They had, some rags that they put on. This was the life of the peasant. And, and then to suddenly have this, right? I mean, it's just, we can't even put ourselves in that frame of mind, But, so to have this train coming by, brightly painted, just that alone. I painted a mural in South Central LA, and people came up to me. No one has ever done anything of beauty for us. No one has done anything beautiful. Every mural I painted, workers, have come up and said, no one has ever told our story. And think about it. No one ever does. I was in the Ukraine, and some kids, they heard there was a radical artist, and they came to talk to me. We were talking, and they asked very seriously, does anybody, they'd started getting Western TV. They said, does anybody in the U.S. work? Because when you watch TV...
Oh, right, yeah, you wouldn't think, yeah.
There's no workers. There's no workers. There's, people sitting in nice apartments in New York that, they will refer to a job. I work in a coffee place or something, which, of course, allows you to have a really fancy, 4-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, of course. The only time you see a worker is when they're being caricatured. Buffoon, the fat plumber with the plumber's crap, that kind of thing. You don't. Workers are invisible. The people who grow our food are invisible. All this stuff about immigrant workers now. If they really got rid of immigrant workers, there'd be no food. There would be no clothing. There would be no building. They're not gonna. They can't even begin to do that because everything would stop. But they'll use it to scare people. They will.
Yeah, they're already backpedaling quick on.
Oh yeah. Well, these yahoos, the MAGA people and whoever, ultimately they're going to do what they're told, and whatever the ruling class wants to happen, that's what's going to happen. And it's not Trump's decision. It's it's the people who own and control the means of production, and he'll do what he's told because he's just a tool like Harris, like all of them are. But workers are invisible, and if you make art about workers, you become invisible. I have painted murals all over the world. I'm the most censored artist in the world. Almost all this stuff's been destroyed, and yet never an inch in an art journal. You become as invisible as the workers you paint for. I'm in the press, the regular press, because of the politics. So there'll be a thing in the New York Times, but never art in America. Never, nothing. No shows, no visiting artists, nothing. You are as invisible as the workers, because there's nothing. There's no images. People who grow our food. Where do you see them? Nothing. At best, there's little caricatures, of the Spanish guy, Anyway, so I'm rambling here a little bit. So, anyway. Anything else? Or should we just start eating and drinking again?
I'm here for the eating and drinking, but I'll say, someone who just got done reveling to a sold-out crowd for 4 days straight at Madison Square Garden, and struck by the powerful experience that that I had and always do have. imagining that, but for class and labor solidarity. I can't imagine how, how intoxicatingly powerful that would feel.
Well, it is, and even fortunately, I'm old enough. I went like during the anti-Vietnam War movement when you have 500,000 people out in the street, and those demonstrations are so important. Were you on the February 3rd in New York when we went?
I went to a few of them.
Yeah. It was the largest anti-war demonstration. It was actually bigger than anything. It was right before the invasion of Iraq. When you're when you can't move because the streets are clogged with human beings, where they are taking care of each other, where there's no problems, where everyone is helping everyone else, where you're all united in this thing, where you're chanting together or singing together, you begin to get a little sense of what's possible. You begin to get a little sense of the potential power that you have. And that's one of the reasons it's important to have big legal peaceful demonstrations so that people can do this. These encampments and stuff around Palestine are very good, very important. But what we need is giant marches. That's what we need more than anything. Because there you begin to get a sense of your collective power. The same thing with a militant strike. If you go through a strike at your workplace and everybody gets together and does this stuff, then it transforms people. You're conscious. You become part of something much larger than yourself. Most of us, we go through our daily existence by ourselves. By ourselves. You can work in a little cubicle by yourself. You can go to your apartment by yourself. These days you don't go to movies necessarily. You don't go to laundromat. You just by yourself all the time. Maybe if you're lucky, you have family, whatever. But there's a lot of alienated people, and that's one of the reasons people start driving their cars into human beings. Because they live in this hopeless, alienated atmosphere. And unless you get a vision of what's possible for the future, it's very easy to go off the tracks. Very easy to go off the tracks. It's amazing that there isn't more of that stuff in this country, I got to tell you. It's amazing. Because, I don't think it's an accident that it tends to be these ex-military guys, because they send them over there and they do horrible things and they see horrible things, and it affects people. And on that cheery note.
Well, thanks for
Thank
the
you
talk.
very much.
Well, all we have to do to prevent this stuff is just overthrow capitalism.
No big deal.
That's all.
It's really,
And make a shit ton of art. No big deal.
Yes. Make great visionary art. That would help too. Well, you can do what you can now, right? You do what you can now. And we do what we can. I know everybody in here does what they can. You go on an action, you help organize something, you do what you can.